Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. Before launching into the major issue of the day, I want to stress that this channel was meant to be a celebration of a region of the world that is beautiful, unsung, and massively underrated. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, the entire Baltic Sea region, it deserves the world's attention, and I can't wait to get back to that fully. But right now, what is unfolding in Ukraine, the enormity of that tragedy and the degree of consequence for the region means that my focus will be on this for the coming weeks. I will try and get a video out every day to update people. I can't obviously guarantee such a volume, but I will do my very best. So from the beginning, 4 a.m. Moscow time today, Vladimir Putin published a video in which he declared general war against Ukraine. He said that the goal will be the demilitarization of Ukraine, in other words, the destruction of its armed forces, and the denazification, so-called, of the country, i.e. regime change. Now, that particular charge, of course, is ironic because Zelensky's family perished in the Holocaust. Speaking of Zelensky, his response to this was his finest moment. People can have their criticisms of him, and I do as well, but his speech was filled with pathos, humanity, sincerity, and seriousness, delivered in Russian to the Russian people. I will leave a link down below. It's well worth your time to have a read. It talks about the deep human pain and suffering that will happen as a consequence of Russia's aggression and the complete absurdity of Putin's claims of Ukrainian belligerence. Other things to criticize about Zelensky? Yes, he was far too slow to recognize and appreciate the reality of the situation. Hundreds of thousands of Russian troops amassing along the Ukrainian border, poised for invasion. He still didn't order a general mobilization because he could not believe the Russian government would really invade to attack fellow Slavs, fellow Orthodox in Ukraine. He should have known better. That said, impossible really to put yourself in his position, a democratic leader facing the Russian onslaught, and he does seem to be making up for lost time. As Putin delivered his remarks, an analysis shows that it was pre-recorded, i.e. a premeditated invasion to take place at precisely this moment, or as this was being broadcast, a massive missile bombardment struck targets all across the Ukraine. Paratrooper battalions dropped in behind enemy lines and attacked various positions from the rear. A little later, the land invasion took place across at least 3 vectors: Crimea in the south, Donbass in the east, and Belarus in the north. Now, critically, Lukashenko has committed his forces to fight alongside Russia. So when we talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's also the invasion of Belarus into Ukraine. They are fighting side by side, and Ukraine is in a state of war with both countries. Ironically enough, when this was occurring, the UN Security Council was in session to discuss Ukraine. They all had their prepared remarks talking about the hopes for peace, demobilization, de-escalation, coming back to the negotiating table. It was a complete farce. Just as the Russian tanks were rolling in and a bombing happening overhead, various countries got up and read from their script as if none of it was happening. As for the people of Ukraine, it is beyond horrific. Scenes of absolute gridlock as people try and escape Kiev to the west. I've seen footage of bombs hitting civilians, people falling from small arms fire and explosions. None of that stuff I will put on YouTube. Nonetheless, people are suffering by the thousands. Militarily, things are unfolding rapidly. As I said, there was a massive aerial bombardment targeting stationary military facilities in Ukraine, particularly airfields, storage dumps, ammunition facilities, anything that wasn't hardened and buried or mobile. At this stage, Russia claims to have eliminated Ukraine's air defenses. That's not entirely true. I've seen live footage of Ukrainian dogfights as recently as minutes ago. Planes continue to be shot out of the sky. I think the latest tally was 6 combat aircraft of Russia plus 1 helicopter. That said, Russia has been successful in seriously degrading Ukrainian airfields. Russia will enjoy air dominance in this conflict for the foreseeable future, although the skies will remain risky from ground attack and various missiles provided by the Europeans and by Americans to shoot down aircraft from the ground. In terms of ground forces, Ukraine has done surprisingly well at retreating ahead of the Russian onslaught while keeping their forces relatively intact. This is critical because the fighting will be largely urban, and I'll come back to that. Right now, the heaviest fighting is in the city of Kharkiv, northeastern Ukraine, where the Ukrainian military is putting up surprisingly stiff resistance, although my reports coming in is that they're sustaining heavy casualties. They're also at risk of encirclement and being cut off from supplies the rest of Ukraine. So how long they can hold out, whether they can break out, whether they can be resupplied where they are, that is a significant military question right now. In the south, Russia has thrust rapidly up to the Dnieper River, facing very little opposition en route. Not something I criticize. It's not a good idea to defend that flat bit of territory. As I say, and as I've said before, Ukraine's fighting will be urban. It will be in those areas that neutralize Russia's armor advantage and where airstrikes have minimal effect. It'll be that street-by-street fighting in Kiev that will determine whether Russia wins or loses this war. How is the conflict playing out? It's too early to say. Russia would expect to have these successes early on. They've been planning this for many months. There are a lot of stationary targets that Russia could easily hit. And Russia, in terms of penetrating deep into Ukrainian territory, can do that with overwhelming force given the preponderance of its military strength. What will determine the outcome, however, is Russia's ability to sustain operations and the degree of civil resistance faced by Russian forces among the civilian populations of Ukraine, i.e., if the Ukrainian people in Kiev are willing to go to the mat to defend their city, then it's going to be very difficult for Russia to have long-term military success. This is because to defeat an insurgency, you need to do two things simultaneously. Number one, break the will of the population to resist, and two, cut off their lines of supply. Now, if Ukraine had no friends, if Ukraine was isolated in a geographically distant part of the world, then the supply question could be addressed. You destroy all of Ukraine's factories, their industrial complex, you stop lines of supply reaching the country, and you gradually chokehold the defenders so that they can no longer fight. They have no ammunition, they have no guns, they have no food, and you can ultimately achieve victory. Now, when it comes to the will to resist, one thing that the West has done extremely successfully is control the narrative. Nobody outside of Russia really believes that Ukraine is the aggressor. Russia does not have a casus belli for this attack. It's something that they have premeditated and orchestrated and are now executing to the abject horror of the rest of the world, galvanizing the support and sympathy of the entire world behind the people of Ukraine. One of the great humiliations of Russia in the lead up to this conflict was the ease with which Western intelligence agencies, American, British, were able to penetrate Russian communications and intentions and disseminate that to the entire world in real time. And the Russians appeared absolutely impotent to do anything about it, even as they saw it happening on the screens of newsrooms around the world. This has meant that Putin has come across as the man he is, the aggressor, the expansionist, the person who wants to rebuild the Russian Empire as part of his grandiose narcissistic vision. What this does is give the Ukrainian people a sense of hope. They know the rest of the world is behind them. They know sanctions are being imposed on Russia. They know military assistance, arms, weapons, food, medical supplies, all of that will find its way in to keep the insurgency going, which will, in the long run, maintain their will to resist. Secondly, the capability. It doesn't matter how many factories or supply dumps or storage facilities that Russia bombs. If you keep tunnels open to the rest of Europe, then supplies are going to find their way into the insurgency. There's no shortage of countries lining up to provide that assistance. So we will have people go into Ukraine. both as foreign fighters wanting to sign up and support Ukraine. And those agencies I mentioned before, they are going to be supplying Ukraine with high-level intelligence, tactical support throughout the entire life cycle of this conflict. So the longer this drags on, the worse it's going to be for Russia. The ruble has already fallen 10%. The sanctions will have further impact. The cost of war, generally, Russia is going to be bankrupted by this. And if this drags on for any period of time, any longer than a few weeks, then this conflict will descend into a quagmire that could end in revolution in Russia. Now, I don't intend to be overly sanguine about Ukraine's military prospects. They are suffering badly right now. There is a possibility that Russia could be successful in thrusting right into Kiev, forcing a capitulation before a meaningful insurgency builds up. But so far, from what I'm observing, the Ukrainian military are doing things in the right way. Zelensky released a statement about an hour ago saying that anyone who wants to fight for Ukraine will be supplied with weapons and ammunition in order to do that. I'm sure he was speaking largely to his own populace, but that will ring true for many foreigners around the world, those with military skills that want to volunteer and employ those skills to defend the cause of freedom and democracy abroad. The greatest ally that Ukraine has is time. If Ukraine can withstand this initial onslaught, and that's a real if, not a rhetorical if, but if Ukraine can hold out, and a lot of this comes down to its willingness to resist, if they can suffer this pain, then in the long run, Russia has grave problems. It can't sustain these operations over huge distances for months on end. The cost is prohibitive. The international response will become increasingly severe. The risk politically at home for Vladimir Putin, he has enemies at home, that will become untenable. So Ukraine can win this. They win by not losing. If they can hold Kiev long enough, then the problems for Russia become untenable. The insurgency will grow stronger. The Russian economy will not be able to sustain these operations. Politically, it becomes untenable for Putin. After all, there'll be heavy militarization in the Baltic area. Eastern NATO will receive thousands of additional troops. Sweden and Finland, they're the ones to watch. They could join NATO as well. And if Ukraine remains free, at least the majority of the country, forget Donetsk and Luhansk, but let's think about the rest of the country. Well, Vladimir Putin can't afford to sue for peace because he knows that Ukraine will then jump to the West and Russia will have invited all of the problems it was seeking to avoid. So Putin is likely to double down, triple down, even as his own power slips away, resulting potentially in a new revolution in Russia itself. So this could be the end of Putin's Russia if Ukraine can hold. I will provide daily updates as how the military situation is unfolding. If you found value in this update, please like and subscribe, share these videos if you think people need to see them, and I will speak to you hopefully tomorrow next time. Goodbye.